Will ran a small tavern near a fading space dock, a place most travelers passed without a second look. The dock had once been loud and bright, full of ships and voices from many worlds, but now only a few vessels came and went each week. The lights flickered more often than they shone, and the metal floors creaked with age. Still, Will opened his tavern every day at the same hour. He wiped the counter, warmed the stoves, and waited for whoever might walk through the door. Will was not a loud man. He spoke little and listened more. His hair was always a bit messy, and his sleeves were often rolled up from work. He had lived near the dock most of his life and had seen many kinds of people pass through. Some stayed a night, some stayed longer, and most were gone by morning. Will never asked where they came from or where they were going. He believed that if someone wanted to tell their story, they would do so on their own. The tavern itself was small but clean. A few wooden tables stood near the walls and the counter stretched across the back. Old pictures hung crooked on the walls, showing the dock in better days. The air always smelled of soup, bread, and warm spices. It was not fancy food, but it filled the stomach and eased the mind. For many travelers that was enough. Each night, as the dock lights dimmed and the sky outside turned dark, the same figure entered the tavern. He was an old alien who walked slowly and carefully, as if each step took effort. His back was bent, and his skin had a pale, faded color that suggested great age. His eyes were large and dark, holding a quiet sadness. He never spoke when he entered. He simply nodded once to Will and moved to the same seat by the window. Will noticed him the first time because the alien looked lost. Many aliens came through the dock, but this one seemed different. He wore simple clothes, worn thin at the edges, and carried nothing with him. No bags, no tools, no signs of wealth or rank. Just an old being who looked tired in a way that went beyond the body. The first night, Will served him soup and bread like any other customer. He placed the bowl gently on the table and waited. The alien looked at the food for a long moment, then at Will as if unsure what to do. Will only gave a small smile and nodded. Slowly the alien began to eat. His movements were careful, almost thankful. When he finished, he placed his hands on the table and bowed his head slightly. Will did not ask for payment. When the alien reached into his clothing and found nothing, Will shook his head and waved it away. The alien looked surprised, then confused, then quietly relieved. He stood, nodded again, and left without a word. The next night he returned. Soon it became a routine. Every evening the old alien arrived just as the tavern lamps were lit. He sat by the window where he could see the dock and the stars beyond. Will brought him soup, bread, and sometimes a warm drink. The alien ate slowly, savoring each bite as if the meal mattered deeply. He never spoke much, only offering short thanks in a soft, careful voice. When asked his name, he said it was Arthur. Will accepted the name without question. He did not wonder if it was real or chosen. Names were just names after all. Other customers noticed Arthur but kept their distance. Some felt uneasy around him, though they could not explain why. Others simply ignored him, focused on their own travels and troubles. A few whispered that he must be important or dangerous, because old beings did not wander alone without reason. Will heard the whispers and paid them no mind. To Will, Arthur was just someone who came in hungry every night. Will had learned long ago that hunger took many forms. Some were easy to see, like an empty stomach. Others were hidden, like loneliness or regret. Will did not know which kind Arthur carried, but he knew kindness cost little. A bowl of soup, a piece of bread, a warm place to sit. These were small things, yet they could mean more than words. Sometimes Will watched Arthur through the corner of his eye as he worked. Arthur often stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the stars. His eyes held memories Will could not guess at. There were moments when Arthur's hands trembled slightly, and he would pause, closing his eyes as if gathering strength. Will noticed these things but never mentioned them. On quiet nights, when few customers came, the tavern felt almost still. The hum of the lights and the distant sound of ships filled the silence. During those times, Arthur would sometimes speak a little more. He would comment on the soup or say the bread reminded him of somewhere long ago. Will listened and responded simply, never pushing for more. Will had his own reasons for being the way he was. Years ago, when he was younger, he had traveled once. He had been far from home when his ship broke down, leaving him stranded on a strange station. A stranger had fed him then, asked nothing in return, and moved on. Will never forgot that kindness. He believed it had kept him going when nothing else could. So when Arthur sat in his tavern each night, Will saw more than an old alien. He saw a traveler who had reached the end of his strength. He saw someone who needed one place where they were not judged or questioned. The dock outside continued to fade with time. More shops closed and more lights went dark. Some nights, Arthur was the only customer left when Will began to clean up. Even then Will never rushed him. Arthur would finish his meal, sit quietly for a while, then stand and leave with a slow, careful step. As the door closed behind him, Will would reset the table, ready for the next night. He never wondered how long Arthur would come or what would happen when he stopped. For now the routine was enough. To Will, Arthur was just hungry. And that was enough. The old alien's hands trembled more as the days passed. Will noticed at first when Arthur tried to lift his bowl and had to stop, steadying himself before taking another sip. The movement was small, but Will saw everything in his tavern. He pretended not to notice and quietly brought the bowl closer so Arthur would not have to reach far. Arthur gave a small nod of thanks, his eyes lowering in a way that showed both pride and shame. Arthur's voice was soft, almost thin, like it had been worn down over many years. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully as if speaking cost him energy. Sometimes his voice faded before the end of a sentence. Will leaned closer when that happened, not to ask him to repeat himself, but to show that he was listening. Will began to learn Arthur's needs without asking. At first he served the same soup he gave everyone else. But one night, Arthur paused after the first spoonful and frowned slightly. He did not complain. He simply kept eating, slower than usual. Will noticed the way Arthur's shoulders tensed and the way his fingers tightened around the spoon. The next night Will changed the soup. He used less salt and added more warmth, letting it simmer longer. Arthur ate that meal with more ease. Over time Will learn more. Arthur could not eat certain spices. Some foods made him tired. Others gave him strength even if only a little. Will watched how Arthur reacted after meals. Did his hands shake more or less? Did he sit straighter? Did his eyes stay open longer? These small signs guided Will's choices. He never asked Arthur what he needed. He simply paid attention. Arthur seemed to understand what Will was doing. One evening after finishing his meal, Arthur looked up and said very quietly, "You observe much." Will smiled faintly and replied, "It's part of the job." Arthur's lips curved into what might have been a smile. The tavern saw more visitors during the middle weeks of the cycle. Traders came through the dock bringing goods from nearby systems. One of them was a woman named Rose. She was human with sharp eyes and quick hands, always counting and measuring. Rose had been coming to the dock for years and knew most faces. She noticed Arthur after seeing him night after night in the same seat. One evening, Rose sat at the counter while Will prepared her meal. She watched Arthur from the corner of her eye, then leaned closer to Will. "That old one," she said quietly, "he's here every night." Will nodded. "Yes." Rose frowned. "You don't charge him." Will kept stirring the pot. "No." Rose lowered her voice further. "You know that's not normal, right? Food isn't free out here." Will placed her plate in front of her. "Everyone needs to eat." Rose studied him for a moment. "That's not what I meant. He's not like the others. There's something about him." Will shrugged. "He's tired." Rose snorted softly. "Aren't we all?" She took a bite, then continued, "I've seen old ones before. Important ones. They don't usually end up alone in places like this." Will wiped the counter slowly. "People end up where they end up." Rose sighed and shook her head. "You're strange, Will." He looked up at her. "Maybe." Rose glanced toward Arthur again. Arthur sat quietly, his hands folded now that his meal was done. His eyes were closed but not in sleep. He looked like he was listening to something far away. "Why do you bother?" Rose asked. Will answered without hesitation. "Everyone needs a place to rest." Rose looked at him for a long time. Then she laughed softly. "You humans," she said. Always soft in the head. But her voice was not unkind. As the days went on, Arthur spoke a little more, though never much. He commented on the weather inside the dome, on the ships passing by, on the taste of bread. Sometimes he asked Will simple questions. "How long have you kept this place?" Or, "Do many travelers still come?" Will answered plainly. Arthur never spoke of his past. Will never asked. On some nights, Arthur's hands shook badly. When that happened, Will would bring a warm drink and wait nearby, pretending to clean. Arthur would wrap his hands around the cup, drawing comfort from the heat. Once, when the shaking did not stop, Will quietly placed his own hand on the table, close but not touching. Arthur noticed and slowly moved his hand closer, until their fingers rested side by side. They stayed that way for a long time, saying nothing. The dock outside grew quieter. Fewer ships arrived. The night stretched longer. Arthur stayed later than before, sometimes until Will began to close up. Will never rushed him. He turned down the lights and let the silence settle. One evening, Arthur tried to stand and nearly fell. Will was there at once, steadying him with a firm but gentle grip. Arthur stiffened at first, then relaxed. "Thank you," he whispered. Will helped him to the door. "Be careful." Arthur paused before leaving. "You do not fear me?" he said. Will shook his head. "No." Arthur looked at him with something close to wonder. "Few do not." After that night, Arthur seemed weaker but also calmer. He ate less, but what he ate gave him comfort. He spoke in short sentences, sometimes stopping to rest. Will adjusted without comment. He made smaller portions, warmer meals, softer bread. Rose returned several times and watched this silent care with growing quiet. One night, she left extra credits on the counter. "For the old one," she said gruffly. Will tried to refuse, but she waved him off. "Don't make it strange." Will accepted them, nodding once. Arthur noticed the change in meals, the care in every movement. One evening he said, "You give much." Will replied, "I give what I can." Arthur looked down at his hands, still trembling, still tired. "It matters," he said. Will smiled faintly and turned back to his work. Outside, the stars moved slowly across the window. Inside, the tavern remained warm. For Arthur it was enough. For Will, it was simply what needed to be done. The evening was quieter than most. Only one ship had arrived at the dock, and its crew never left the landing bay. Inside the tavern, the lights were low and steady, and the air was warm. Will moved slowly behind the counter, cleaning cups that were already clean. He did this when there was little else to do. It helped him think without thinking too hard. Arthur arrived later than usual. His steps were slower, and he paused at the door as if gathering strength. Will noticed at once. He did not call out or rush over. He waited, giving Arthur the time he needed. After a long moment, Arthur walked to his usual seat by the window and sat down carefully. Will brought the soup without being asked. It was warm, plain, and gentle, made the way Arthur seemed to handle best. He set the bowl down and placed the bread beside it. Arthur looked at the food for a long time before touching it. "Thank you," Arthur said. His voice was quieter than usual. Will nodded and returned to the counter. Arthur ate slowly. Between each spoonful, he paused, resting his hands on the table. They trembled more tonight, not just from weakness but from something else Will could not name. The tavern was silent except for the soft sound of the spoon touching the bowl. After a while, Arthur spoke again. "Will." Will looked up. Arthur rarely said his name. "Yes." "I will speak tonight," Arthur said. "If that is all right." Will considered this for a moment, then nodded. "You can speak if you want." Arthur took a breath. "I have not spoken much in a long time." "That's fine," Will said. "You don't have to rush." Arthur seemed to relax at that. He took another spoonful, then another. Finally, he set the spoon down and folded his hands together, as if steadying himself. "Long ago," Arthur began, "I was not alone." Will leaned against the counter, listening. "I worked with many," Arthur continued. "Many worlds. Many kinds of people. They did not always understand one another. Fear was common. Anger came easily." He paused, eyes drifting to the stars outside the window. "I helped them talk." Will said nothing. "I was not a ruler," Arthur said softly. "I did not command armies. I listened. I carried words from one to another. I explained fears. I slowed things down." Arthur's voice grew steadier as he spoke, as if the words themselves were giving him strength. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it saved worlds. Will remained quiet. He refilled Arthur's bowl when it grew low, placing it gently on the table. Arthur looked at the fresh soup and nodded in thanks, then continued. "They called it peacekeeping," Arthur said. "But peace is not something you keep in a box. It must be held carefully every day." Arthur's hands trembled again and he wrapped them around the warm bowl. "I did this for a long time. Longer than most humans live." Will's eyes flickered briefly with interest, but he did not interrupt. "There came a time," Arthur said, "when I failed." The word hung in the air. "I believed I understood everyone," Arthur went on. "I believed I could fix anything if I listened long enough. I was wrong." He closed his eyes. "I missed something small. A word, a tone, a silence." Arthur's voice dropped even lower. That silence grew. Will waited. When the talks ended, Arthur said, "They did not end in peace." He did not describe what followed. He did not need to. The weight in his voice said enough. Arthur opened his eyes again. They looked older now, heavier. "After that, they wanted me to continue. To try again. To fix what I had failed to stop." Will watched him carefully. "But I could not," Arthur said. "I no longer trusted myself." He lifted his gaze to Will. So I left. You disappeared, Will said, not as a question. Arthur nodded. I stepped away. I gave up my place. I chose to be forgotten. The tavern felt smaller then, as if the walls had moved closer. Will took a breath and let it out slowly. That sounds heavy. Arthur gave a faint, tired smile. It was lighter than staying. For a while neither of them spoke. Will went back to his work, wiping the counter, checking the stove. He moved with the same calm motions as always. Arthur watched him quietly. After some time, Arthur spoke again. Most would have asked by now. Asked what? Will said. Who I was, Arthur replied. Why I am here. What I have done. Will shrugged. If you wanted to tell me, you would. Arthur studied him. You are not curious? I am, Will said honestly. But curiosity doesn't mean I need answers. Arthur seemed to think about that. Where I come from, he said slowly, they believe knowledge must always be used. Will glanced over. Used for what? For control, Arthur said. For power. For safety, they say. Will returned to the counter. Sounds tiring. Arthur let out a quiet sound that might have been laughter. Yes. Very. Arthur took another bite of soup. I expected anger when I told you, he said. Or fear. Will shook his head. I don't see why. Arthur looked surprised. I failed many. Will considered this. Everyone fails someone. Arthur's hands stilled for a moment. Not on that scale. Will met his eyes. Scale doesn't change how it feels. Arthur looked down at his bowl. His shoulders lowered just a little. You are strange, he said softly. So I'm told, Will replied. Arthur grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not heavy or guarded. It felt like rest. He finished his soup slowly, savoring it more than usual. When he was done, Will refilled the bowl again, though Arthur had not asked. Arthur looked up, surprised. You don't need to eat it all, Will said. Just keep it warm. Arthur nodded. You treat me the same, he said. Will frowned slightly. Should I not? Arthur searched for words. After knowing what I was. Will shook his head. You're still Arthur. Arthur's eyes shone faintly in the low light. Few see it that way. Will wiped his hands on a cloth. I run a tavern. Not a court. Arthur smiled then, a real smile this time, small but clear. I think, he said, this may be the safest place I have ever been. Outside, a ship's lights moved slowly across the window, then faded into the distance. Inside, the tavern remained still. Arthur sat for a long time after that, saying nothing more. Will did not press him. He cleaned, closed a few shutters, and turned the lights down a little more. When Arthur finally stood, he moved with care, but there was less strain in his posture. He paused at the door. Thank you, he said again. Will nodded. Same time tomorrow. Arthur inclined his head and stepped out into the night. Will watched the door close, then returned to the counter. He picked up Arthur's empty bowl and washed it like any other. Nothing had changed. And somehow that meant everything. Morning came slowly to the edge of the space dock. The sky above the settlement was pale and dull, covered by thin clouds that never fully cleared. Will woke as he always did before the public lights turned on. He sat up in bed and listened to the quiet hum of the station systems around him. It was a sound he had known all his life. It meant things were still working. He washed his face, dressed, and was about to put on his boots when he noticed something strange. The usual quiet outside his small home felt different. Too still. Too heavy. Will stepped to the window and looked out. Black vehicles lined the narrow street in front of his building. They were smooth and unmarked, their surfaces dark enough to swallow the weak morning light. They were not dock vehicles and not trader transports. They were official. Will knew that at once, even though there were no symbols. Several figures stood near the vehicles. They wore simple uniforms in dark colors. No weapons were visible, but their posture was alert. They were waiting. Will did not panic. He stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly. He thought of Arthur, of the quiet words from the night before, of the way Arthur's hands had trembled less by the end of the evening. Will felt a small weight settle in his chest. He finished getting ready and stepped outside. The figures turned toward him at once. One of them stepped forward. She was human, middle-aged, with calm eyes and short hair pulled back tight. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and polite. Will Carter? She asked. Yes, Will replied. I am here on official business, she said. May we speak? Will nodded. Inside or here? Here is fine, she said, glancing around the quiet street. She gestured to the others, who remained where they were, watching but not moving closer. We are looking for an individual who frequents your tavern, she continued. An older alien known as Arthur. Will did not hide his surprise, but he did not deny it either. He comes in most nights, he said. The woman studied his face. How long has he been coming? A while, Will replied. I don't keep count. What do you know about him? She asked. Will thought carefully. He's old. He's tired. Eats soup and bread. He sits by the window. The woman blinked just once. You know nothing else? I know what he's told me, Will said. And that's enough. There was a pause. The woman exchanged a glance with another official, then looked back at Will. He is of interest to several groups, she said. Some consider him important. Will shrugged. That doesn't change who he is when he's hungry. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in thought. Do you believe he is dangerous? Will shook his head without hesitation. No. Why are you so certain? She asked. Will met her gaze. Danger doesn't look like that. He's just tired. Another pause followed. The officials seemed unsettled, though Will could not say why. The woman finally nodded. Thank you for your honesty, she said. We would like to speak with him. I can tell you where he'll be tonight, Will said. That won't be necessary, a new voice said. They all turned. Arthur stood a short distance down the street. He leaned on a walking stick Will had never seen before. His posture was weak, but his eyes were clear. He had arrived quietly as he always did. I am here, Arthur said softly. Will's chest tightened. Arthur. Arthur raised one trembling hand. It is all right. The officials looked at him with sudden focus. Several of them stiffened, though they did not move forward. The woman stepped closer, her tone respectful. Arthur, she said, speaking his name carefully. Thank you for coming forward. Arthur inclined his head. I expected this day. Will moved closer to Arthur without thinking, standing slightly to his side. He did not touch him, but his presence was clear. Arthur noticed and gave him a brief look of gratitude. We only wish to talk, the woman said. No force will be used. Arthur nodded. That is good. One of the officials glanced at Will. You have shown him kindness, he said. Why? Will answered simply. Because he needed it. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his voice was steady. I would like to speak, he said. But not here. The woman nodded. Of course. They moved to one of the vehicles. The door opened smoothly. Arthur hesitated, then turned to Will. You did not owe me anything, he said. Yet you gave much. Will shook his head. I just served food. Arthur smiled faintly. You gave rest. Arthur stepped into the vehicle on his own. No one touched him. The door closed quietly. The vehicles left as smoothly as they had arrived, disappearing down the street without sound. Soon the street was empty again. Will stood alone for a long moment. That evening Will opened his tavern as usual. He cleaned the counter and warmed the stove. The seat by the window remained empty. Rose came in later and noticed at once. Where's the old one? She asked. Will paused. He had somewhere to go. She frowned. Those vehicles this morning, that was about him, wasn't it? Will nodded. Is he in trouble? She asked. I don't think so, Will said. At least not the kind that hurts. Rose studied him. You're calm. Will looked at the empty seat. He stepped forward on his own. The night passed slowly. Fewer customers came than usual. Will found himself glancing at the door more than once. Days passed. On the fourth day Arthur returned. He looked cleaner, his clothes new but simple. He walked without the stick, though still slowly. When he entered the tavern, the room seemed to hold its breath. Will looked up, and relief crossed his face before he could stop it. You're back, he said. Yes, Arthur replied. They wished to talk. Only that. Arthur took his usual seat. Will brought soup without being asked. They asked many questions, Arthur said quietly. They wished to understand why I left. Why I stayed away. And? Will asked. Arthur wrapped his hands around the bowl. They listened. That was new. Will nodded. Listening helps. Arthur looked at him with deep gratitude. They said I would have remained hidden much longer, he said, if not for you. Will frowned. I didn't do anything. Arthur shook his head. You reminded me I was still a person. Arthur ate slowly, peacefully. The tremble in his hands was less now. When he finished, he looked at Will. Thank you, he said again. Will smiled faintly. Same as always. Outside, the dock lights flickered, then steadied. Inside, the tavern felt whole again. Arthur was no longer alone. Anwell had simply done what he always did. The officials did not come back again. There were no more black vehicles on the street, no quiet figures watching from corners. Life near the dock returned to its slow, familiar rhythm. The lights flickered as they always had, the air hummed softly, and ships came and went without ceremony. Whatever business the officials had come for, it was finished. Arthur continued to visit the tavern each evening. There was a change in him, though it was gentle and not easy to name. He still walked slowly and his hands still shook at times, but there was less weight in his posture. He no longer looked like someone waiting for an ending. He looked like someone who had found a place to sit for a while. One night, a few days after his return, Arthur spoke again. Not at length and not with many details, but enough. They listened, he said, holding his bowl with both hands. Not all of them, but enough. Will nodded as he wiped the counter. That helps. Arthur looked toward the window where the stars drifted slowly past. They understood what was done, he said. What was prevented. What was lost. He paused. They said my leaving was not cowardice. Will glanced over. I never thought it was. Arthur's lips curved slightly. That matters more than you know. Word spread quietly at first. Not through announcements or news feeds, but through travelers. Someone would mention a calm place near the old dock. A tavern where the food was warm and the keeper listened more than he spoke. A place where no one pushed and no one judged. More people began to come. They were not wealthy or powerful for the most part. They were tired pilots, long-haul traders, workers between contracts, and beings from worlds most humans had never heard of. They sat at the tables, drank slowly and talked softly. Some shared stories. Some sat in silence. Will treated them all the same. Arthur remained by the window. Sometimes travelers recognized him. They would pause, look again, and then look away. A few bowed their heads slightly as they passed. Arthur noticed but said nothing. Will noticed too, but he did not ask. One evening, Rose returned after a long absence. She looked around the tavern, now fuller than before, and raised an eyebrow. You've become popular, she said. Will shrugged. People get hungry. Rose smiled faintly. That's not all they get here. She glanced at Arthur. They figured it out, didn't they? Arthur answered before Will could. They did. Rose studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. She sat at the counter and lowered her voice. You know, she said to Will, some places would have tried to profit from this. From him. Will poured her a drink. This isn't that kind of place. Rose took a sip. No. It isn't. Arthur's health improved slowly. Not quickly, not like a miracle, but steadily. He ate a little more each night. He spoke a little longer. Sometimes he even laughed, a soft sound that surprised everyone, including himself. One night he told Will, they offered me a return. Will paused. And? Arthur shook his head. I said no. Not yet. Why? Will asked. Arthur looked around the tavern. At the tables, at the low lights, at the steady calm. Because peace does not only live in councils, he said. Sometimes it lives here. Will nodded. You're welcome to stay. Arthur smiled. I know. The tavern became known as a quiet place. Not famous, not grand, but steady. Some came once and never returned. Others came back whenever they passed through the system. A few stayed longer, helping clean, sharing meals, fixing small things around the dock. Will accepted it all without comment. He did not change the menu. He did not raise prices. He did not put up signs or tell stories. When asked why his tavern felt different, he always gave the same answer. Everyone needs a place to rest. Arthur remained part of the routine. He came in at the same hour, sat in the same seat, and ate the same simple food. Sometimes he talked with travelers who asked gentle questions. Sometimes he only listened. One evening, a young traveler asked him, "Were you really important once?" Arthur considered this. Once, he said. And again in a different way. The traveler frowned. Which was better? Arthur glanced at Will, who was setting down bowls at another table. This, Arthur said. The dock never returned to its old glory. It remained worn and quiet, its best days behind it. But it did not empty out either. It endured. So did the tavern. Will grew older slowly as humans do. His hands gained small lines, his hair showed more gray. He still opened the tavern every day. Arthur aged too, though in ways that were harder to see. He stayed. No statues were built. No records were changed. No great speeches were made. But travelers remembered. They remembered the human who fed an old alien without asking who he was. They remembered the place where nothing was demanded, and something important was given freely. And they carried that memory with them from system to system, world to world. the galaxy moved on as it always did. In a small tavern near a fading dock, kindness stayed.